So the committee will come to order. We have Republicans on the right, Democrats on the left. I know better. If you are here for the Whitewater book, my guess is that you're part of the 22% who still thinks George Bush is a better president than McKinley. I will allow you a few moments to leave, and we'll proceed. I wanted to. It's an odd event because I think Jeremy Scahill, the author of this book, the Blackwater book, not Whitewater, would agree with me that he's returning to a state that made his work possible. Other than this Capitol building where George Bush somehow managed to get himself elected president, what seems like 50 years ago. I will say that the Texas government has improved since I covered the Capitol. There are now electronic towel dispensers in the men's room. Really, the only more appropriate place for this gathering with this particular book, I think, would be the ranch, the Armstrong Ranch, 250 miles to the south of here, where the vice president shot his good friend and one of the few good Republicans in the state in the face. And Dick Cheney indeed played a part in this because it was his work at the Department of Defense that made much of this renegade contracting and predatory capitalism about which Jeremy writes possible. Terrific book. Some writers write good books. Some writers write timely books. Jeremy Scahill did both. It is an indictment of the predatory capitalism that has guards in Baghdad, mercenary guards in Baghdad, stormtroopers cleaning up after Katrina, and more recent hurricanes, and thugs guarding our border. It is a paperback. My job is to introduce Jeremy. I would hope that your function is to buy these books because the paperbacks are cheaper. A good opportunity to buy now in the book tent afterwards. And Jeremy will speak for as long as he speaks.
Yeah, 20, 30 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we will turn the microphone over to the audience for questioning. Thank you for joining us, and really, I urge you to buy a fine work of both investigative reporting and terrific storytelling. Jeremy Scahill.
Thank you. I was going to bang the gavel, so you took my thunder away from me there, Lou. It's a real honor to be here, and an honor particularly to be with Lou Dubose, who I think is one of this nation's finest journalists, and really was instrumental in the early stages of the Bush presidency in understanding what I think many in Texas already knew, but what was going to be unleashed on all of us. And I think Lou is to be given a great deal of credit for the incredible investigative journalism that he's done, much of it emanating from Texas, but certainly of incredible national and international significance. So thank you, Lou.
Oh, thank you.
I want to begin by saying that I'm neither a Democrat nor a Republican. I consider myself a journalist, and I was the same journalist when Bill Clinton was president as I've been when George Bush is president. And I think that journalists in a society that purports to be a democratic society have three major functions. The first is to provide people with information that can empower them to make decisions in the society. The second is to hold those in power accountable. And the third is to give voice to those who have been excluded from the public airwaves or whose voices are simply not heard on media outlets. And part of that mission, in my case, has been to travel to countries around the world that are on the other side of the barrel of the gun that is U.S. foreign policy. And my work as a journalist has taken me to the oil-rich region of the Niger Delta to expose the Chevron Corporation's involvement with the killing of indigenous villagers in the Niger Delta. In fact, the documentary that I did with my colleague and wonderful friend Amy Goodman, called Drilling and Killing Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship, actually resulted in a major federal lawsuit against the Chevron Oil Corporation for wrongful death brought on the part of villagers in the Niger Delta as part of a story that we did, and that case just began last Monday, and Chevron is being sued the way that an individual citizen would be sued. So they have their cake and they have to eat it too, which is that corporations want to have equal rights to human beings. Well, then victims of these corporations should be able to sue them as they would a human being who was responsible or complicit in deaths and torture of civilians. I also reported from Yugoslavia under the Clinton administration during the 78-day NATO bombing of that country, the so-called Kosovo War, and I began traveling to Iraq in 1997 at a time when there was very little media attention paid to Iraq, save for a story here or there about weapons inspectors and then the 4 days of bombing that Iraqis endured when Clinton launched airstrikes in December of 1998. I went into Iraq the first time with a group of humanitarian activists from an organization called Voices in the Wilderness who were making it their life's mission or life's work to, in a symbolic but also real way, break the U.S.-led sanctions against Iraq and to bring in medical supplies and foodstuffs that were banned from import by a U.S.-led United Nations at the time. It also was a country that was enduring the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam under Bill Clinton's presidency, under the guise of the no-fly zones in northern and southern Iraq. On 9/11, I had been already traveling to Iraq for a number of years in and out, and when I watched the towers falling, I said to the colleagues and friends I was with that I believe firmly that the Bush administration was going to attack Iraq, and all of us who had been covering Iraq knew that the narrative that was put forward about WMDs and connections to Al-Qaeda was a false narrative. But I basically dropped everything I was doing and committed myself to reporting in Iraq, and I'll say it quite bluntly. I was trying to stop the U.S. invasion and attack on Iraq because I thought it would have been an illegal war, an immoral war, and one which would have further punished the people of Iraq, and in fact a war that was based on lies. My gateway into the Blackwater story was very much born of my experience in Iraq. I, by chance, ended up spending a great deal of time in the Iraqi city of Fallujah, which is in the west of the country. Very conservative, religious city. They call it the city of mosques because of its high percentage of religious structures compared to housing structures. In fact, I had camped out in the desert of Fallujah for several days a few months before the U.S. invasion took place. And it was a city that very much shaped my understanding of the long-term impact of bombing of civilian infrastructure, because Fallujah was one of the places that suffered the greatest, one of the greatest massacres of the Gulf War, when a quote-unquote errant missile in the era of smart bombs smashed into a marketplace in January of 1991. Killing 78 Iraqi civilians. And when I was traveling to Fallujah during the 90s and the early 2000s, it was still something that people were talking about, and you would still meet people who had family members killed or were injured in that bombing. And I understood the anger of the people of Fallujah, but what always moved me was how they said, we don't view you as your government. Now it's a very different reality in Iraq. I think after the re-election of Bush in 2004, much of the world said the Americans are crazy, and that line no longer holds water. Having spent time in this city of Fallujah, I watched with great passion the events of March 31st, 2004, and it was probably the first time many of you heard of Blackwater. 4 Blackwater operatives were ambushed and killed in the Iraqi city of Fallujah. Their bodies dragged through the streets in a very macabre display. They were burned and strung up from a bridge over the Euphrates River. And I'll never forget seeing a young Iraqi boy, probably 16, 15 years old, holding up a sign as a mob danced on the bodies of these Americans that said, "Fallujah is the graveyard of the Americans." Now, to put this in a context, when the killing of these 4 Blackwater operatives, who were not U.S. soldiers and were not U.S. civilians, when they were killed, the U.S. military had already declared Fallujah a no-go zone. There had been fierce resistance. The Marines had withdrawn to the outskirts of the city and were not traveling inside of Fallujah because they felt that to launch an offensive on that city would have been to subject U.S. military lives unnecessarily to the possibility of death or serious injury, but also that it would run a high risk of hurting a civilian population with a tremendous number of children. When the Blackwater men were killed, the Bush administration spun it as though civilian workers were killed or the Red Cross had been ambushed. In fact, several newspapers in the United States simply used the term American civilians butchered in Fallujah or civilian contractors from America killed in Fallujah. Growing up, my idea of what a contractor was is someone who's engaged in construction or building projects. You don't necessarily think of mercenaries armed to the teeth riding through, the streets of a war zone. But this was really when that term was born in the pop culture of America, and now we refer to them generically as private contractors. But what these men actually were private soldiers hired by a for-profit mercenary company called Blackwater USA at the time, and they were working for another major corporation, in fact the largest war corporation operating in Iraq, KBR, of course a former subsidiary of Halliburton, Dick Cheney's quote-unquote former company, and a company of course with very deep roots in Texas history and in the U.S. war machine. When those men were killed and the media campaign was launched to portray them as civilians who were there to help the people of Iraq, what the Bush administration did, as it has often done, was to go over the heads of military commanders on the ground and to order for political reasons and for revenge purposes a massive assault on the city of Fallujah. And the military carried out an incredible and stunning number of 30,000 airstrikes on the city, including the bombing of a mosque. Hundreds of Iraqi civilians were killed, thousands were displaced from their homes, and in many ways it was the incident that turned the course of the Iraq War. You can draw a direct correlation between the killing of the Blackwater men and an escalation of the killing of U.S. soldiers by Iraqi resistance fighters. The Fallujah ambush, combined with the Bush administration's revenge attack, combined with the fact that the super genius L. Paul Bremer, who was the original proconsul of Baghdad after a brief stint by General J. Garner, he decided to fire 250,000 Iraqi soldiers, and in the words of one official, when he did that, it was the day we made 250,000 armed enemies in Iraq. So you can draw a direct link between the Fallujah killings of the Blackwater men, the Bush administration response, and the general policy of firing the military to understand how it was that U.S. troops started dying in much greater numbers after March 31st, 2004. So I set out to investigate this company based on a simple question. How were the lives of 4 men who were not U.S. soldiers and were certainly not civilians worth the destruction of an entire Iraqi city, the collective punishment of a population, and worth the political cost and the human cost for the United States operations in Iraq? I was covering this story in an informal way for Democracy Now! And The Nation magazine, and then unrelated to this, I went down to New Orleans to cover Hurricane Katrina in the immediate aftermath of the breaking of the levees and the flooding of the city. And one of the first days I was there, I was standing in the French Quarter talking to 2 New York City police officers who had come down to volunteer, and an unmarked car pulls up next to us, and 3 large men get out of it wearing khaki uniforms, wielding M4 assault rifles, Glock 9 pistols strapped to their legs, and they came up and said to the police officers, "Where are the rest of the Blackwater guys?" And that word rest really resonated with me at the time in the sense that it sent me into a state of not really listening to the rest of what was being said because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And the police officers told them where the rest of the Blackwater guys, and they were on their way. And I said to the cops, where are the Blackwater guys? You mean the guys in Iraq and Afghanistan? They said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "Well, I'd like to interview them. Where are they?" And I said, "You can go either way on this street," implying they're everywhere. Just walk one way and you'll find them. And sure enough, I walked down Bourbon Street and in the French Quarter and found a bunch of Blackwater guys. They were clearing out an apartment overlooking a bar and throwing furniture over the balcony of this apartment, and then they draped an American flag, and I struck up a conversation with them, and they described their mission there as being there to, quote, confront criminals and stop looters. Some of them had just been in Iraq 2 weeks earlier. One was complaining that there wasn't enough action in New Orleans. I don't know about you, but when I hear a guy who's just been in Iraq fighting an insurgency war saying there's not enough action in the streets of an American city, it sent a chill up my spine. And I was determined to try to get to the bottom of who sent you here. So I asked them, what are you doing here? Who sent you here? And they said, "Our boss." And I said, "What's your mission?" "We're here to help." I said, but under whose auspices are you operating? I mean, what's your authorization to be here? And this seemed like posse stuff to me, or militia stuff. And they said, "Well, it's above our pay grade." And one guy finally whips out a badge from under his bulletproof attire, and it's a gold badge. And he says, "I was deputized by the governor of the state of Louisiana, and I've been authorized to use lethal force if I deem it necessary." Well, as I tried to figure out who it was exactly that hired them, we heard a denial from the Bush administration. We have not hired any private forces. We have all the security we need in Louisiana. Now, why would this have been a politically sensitive question? Well, because the Louisiana National Guard had been sent abroad to Afghanistan and Iraq as part of Bush's wars, and so they weren't there when the people of Louisiana desperately needed them. And in fact, this tore apart many of those National Guard soldiers. When they eventually came back, I talked to them about it, and it was a stunning display of young men and women who were not necessarily against the war, but were saying we had no business being gone when our people needed us. And so for the Bush administration to admit that they had hired private forces would have been to admit a huge part of the problem in the Gulf, which was that there was no effective response that was mobilized to help people. And it wasn't just New Orleans. Of course, it hit Texas very hard and other states in the South. So eventually, after we pushed it, we found out that the Department of Homeland Security had hired Blackwater. Now, the men on the ground for Blackwater told me they were getting $350 per man per day plus a per diem, and they were complaining that that was low pay compared to what they were getting in Iraq. But when I got Blackwater's contracts with the Department of Homeland Security, it turns out that the company was billing U.S. taxpayers $950 per man per day in the hurricane zone. Blackwater made over $70 million from its New Orleans operations, and Blackwater armed operatives were stretched all the way from Texas through Mississippi at the height of the so-called relief operations. Now, their official job was that they were there to protect FEMA. I'm not sure if FEMA has even reached the Gulf yet, but they definitely had mercenaries operating on a no-bid contract working for the Bush administration. So when I dug deeper into this company and tried to figure out how this happened, what I realized very quickly was that Blackwater and its history was a sort of metaphor for much of what was happening in the United States, or much of what had happened in the United States over the 2 terms of the Bush administration. It turns out that the company is owned by one man named Eric Prince, who is a son of a very powerful, wealthy couple that were major bankrollers of the rise of the radical religious right. His father, Edgar Prince, was a very successful businessman in the U.S. state of Michigan, and he built up an auto parts manufacturing company called Prince Manufacturing in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. And the most famous invention of this company is something that many of you probably have in your cars. It's the now ubiquitous lighted sun visor. You pull down the visor in your car and it lights up. You've got a bit of Blackwater's history rolling around in your vehicle with you. So Eric Prince grows up in a house not just where he watches his father, who was a self-made man, build up a successful business, but to use the company and its profits as a cash-generating engine to fuel and fund the rise of the radical religious right. This family became the premier bankroller of James Dobson and his focus on the Family Prayer Warrior Network. Major player in conservative politics today. Gary Bauer and the Family Research Council, they gave him the seed money to start the FRC. Eric Prince's sister, Betsy, married Dick DeVos, the heir to the Amway Corporation fortune, the owners of the Orlando Magic basketball team, the single greatest bankrollers of the Republican Revolution. And these 2 families merged together in the kind of marriages that were commonplace in the monarchies of old Europe. And they formed this formidable behind-the-scenes power player in radical right-wing politics in the United States. Eric Prince, as a young man, was an intern in George H.W. Bush's White House, but he complained that it wasn't conservative enough for him on gay issues, the budget, and the environment. So he backed Pat Buchanan's insurgency campaign in 1992 while his sister Betsy was running part of the Bush campaign operation in the state of Michigan. Now, unlike many children of the wealthy in this country, Eric Prince made the decision to join the military. In fact, some Democrats in the Congress, when he was forced to appear on the Hill, actually gave him credit for that, because this was certainly not someone who needed the military to get him a college education. He wanted to be in the military, and he ended up getting into the U.S. Navy SEALs, which is one of the most elite, some would say the most elite segment of the U.S. military. And he had deployments in the 90s in Haiti and Bosnia and the Mediterranean. In the mid-1990s, in 1995, his father died suddenly of a heart attack, and so Eric Prince leaves the Navy SEALs, goes back to Michigan to help his family sort through what to do with the family business, and ultimately they decide to sell Prince Manufacturing for about $1 billion in cash. Eric Prince takes his share of the inheritance, gets together with a couple of Special Forces buddies, and they go out to the Great Dismal Swamp of North Carolina and buy several thousand acres of land and began building up what would later become Blackwater. Now, at the beginning, and it's important to understand this history because this was a company that didn't exist 10 years ago. Today, it's one of the most powerful war contractors in the most powerful nation on earth. When they started Blackwater in 97, 98, the original name of it was Blackwater Lodge and Training Center. And the idea was that it was going to be a combination of an outdoor shooting range, a sportsman's paradise where guys in I suppose a few women would come to train in how to use their weapons better or study other weapon systems, but they also, in their early literature, said that they wanted to take advantage of what they saw as an acceleration of government outsourcing of security and firearms-related training. So they operated on these two tracks for the beginning stages of the company's existence. And in 1999, the first of what would be almost annual tragedies that would benefit Blackwater took place, the Columbine shooting in Colorado. Blackwater responded to Columbine by erecting a mock high school, a fake high school on their compound in North Carolina, and they called it Are You Ready High? And the letter R and the letter U, and they invited law enforcement agents from around the United States to train in how to face down against the violent youth of America's schools. And in 2000, it was the bombing of the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen, which was one of the most devastating, quote-unquote, peacetime attacks against a U.S. ship. Blackwater got a $35 million contract from the Navy through Eric Prince's connections in the Navy SEALs. But the real money for the company, and in fact the event that really shaped its future, was 9/11. Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, was not someone who gave press conferences or wrote op-eds for the most part, but he did appear on one network after 9/11. You might be able to imagine which TV network it was. It was Fox News, and he was on with Bill O'Reilly, and he was talking about the federal air marshal program and whether marshals should be armed, and Blackwater was offering to train air marshals, but he said something in general that I found fascinating. He said that before 9/11, he was getting cynical about how seriously people took the business of security and firearms training. Now, he said, the phone is ringing off the hook at Blackwater. And among the early calls to come into Blackwater after 9/11 was from the Central Intelligence Agency, which contracted Blackwater on a black contract, a secret contract, to insert a team of special forces operators who used to be in the U.S. military and now were on the free market, to insert them inside of Afghanistan in the early stages of U.S. operations there. And this was part of Rumsfeld's revolution in military affairs and the broader Rumsfeld doctrine. Sarah Palin doesn't quite know what that is, but we can talk about that in a moment. One aspect, though, of the Rumsfeld doctrine that doesn't get talked about much is the idea that you are going to utilize to the maximum the participation of the private sector in the waging of U.S. wars, and that this in turn will create a leaner, meaner, more efficient U.S. military machine. Part of this has to do with military technology, but part of it also has to do with using private companies to outsource a section of your combat. And so Rumsfeld's idea, and Cheney certainly was a major force in this, was to start hiring former U.S. soldiers with special forces experience that would effectively serve as an armed wing of the administration, not under U.S. military command, but under the direct command of the executive branch of the United States. It is a multi-thousand person paramilitary squad that answers directly to the Secretary of State and the President, and does not go through military command and is not subjected to military laws. It is effectively above the law. It provides the Bush administration with a great amount of political cover for covert operations, as well as removes the oversight capacity of the Congress even further away from the waging of U.S. wars by using these private companies. The contract in Afghanistan was a relatively small one, but it got Blackwater in the game. It was the first time that this company crossed the line from being a sportsman's paradise training facility to actually providing soldiers of fortune or soldiers for hire to the United States government and other entities, foreign governments and private corporations. When Paul Bremer hit the ground in Baghdad, it wasn't the U.S. military that was tasked with protecting him. His elite bodyguards would be provided by Blackwater on an initial $27 million no-bid contract. Now, within a year, it would swell to $300 million, and then soon would be $1 billion. Blackwater, almost overnight, was handed the primary position in what would become a very lucrative market in Iraq, and now is expanding around the world. In fact, the Times of London said about a year into the occupation that in post-invasion Iraq, in other words, in occupied Iraq, the real gold rush is not oil, it's private security. When Blackwater got this detail from the United States government, this assignment, it overnight shot up rates for personal security details in Iraq to the point where some people were getting paid $1,000 a day, much of it tax-free, to serve as private bodyguards in the U.S. war zone, operating alongside troops who were getting paid, if they were lucky, $40,000 a year with combat pay and hazard bonuses, etc., to be in that exact same war zone. Blackwater essentially broke this game wide open and has been in Iraq as the premier bodyguard operation of the occupation almost from day one. They've guarded every U.S. ambassador, over 100 congressional delegations. They've guarded Nancy Pelosi when she's gone there, Barack Obama when he's gone to Afghanistan. You see, and I want to wrap up here and leave room for some discussion here. If you step back from it and you look at the bigger picture, some people say, well, Bush's Iraq policy was a failure. And I think there's a debate to be had there that is going on in the corporate media. But what almost is never discussed is that it was an incredible victory for corporations. We have seen one of the greatest transfers of public money to the private sector in the history of our nation, perhaps the greatest transfer of public monies to the private sector. In Iraq right now, there are 145,000 United States soldiers who wear the American flag on their shoulder. They operate alongside 196,000 corporate personnel who work for a network of 630 corporations. The U.S. spends $2.5 billion a week occupying Iraq. 40 cents on the dollar goes directly to for-profit war corporations. These companies are not philanthropic enterprises. What they're using this public money for is to build up their private infrastructure. Now you have the fact that there are 300 mercenary companies working in Iraq alone. That's almost twice the number of nations as there are registered at the UN. And Blackwater is at the tip of the spear of this operation. What it means is that through our money, through U.S. taxpayer money, these companies have built up armed forces in some cases that would be capable of taking out a small national military. Some of these companies have operations in 38 nations around the globe. British companies are firmly entrenched in the U.S. Gulf working in relief operations, but in Iraq they're mercenary companies. Blackwater also has hired and brought into the United States people from around the world. You know, there are more nation states represented on the Blackwater payroll than there are in Bush's official coalition. There's no more coalition of willing nations. There's a coalition of willing corporations. So when Chile, the nation of Chile, says we don't want to participate in the Iraq war, Bush says that's fine. We'll just send Blackwater into Chile to hire Chilean soldiers and deploy them in a U.S. war zone that their home government is opposed to participating in. Some of the Chileans that were hired by Blackwater were seasoned veterans of the Pinochet era. They were commandos who served under the brutal regime of Augusto Pinochet. We paid their salaries while they were in Iraq. These were people that are wanted as human rights abusers in Chile. They then have rebranded themselves as private soldiers working for the United States government through Blackwater. Now these companies are sort of realizing that the gold rush in Iraq is over and they're moving on to bigger and better things. Two major projects that Blackwater has undertaken recently are the following. One is they want to get into the so-called war on drugs. They are currently bidding for a share of an incredibly large $15 billion Pentagon contract to, quote, fight terrorists with drug trade ties. This is a project that could bring Blackwater into Colombia, Bolivia, as well as in Central Asia. If you want to know what's going on with Blackwater's training of counter-narcotics forces, look recently at what happened in Afghanistan, where people that were Afghan police that were trained by Blackwater defected to the Taliban and then showed their Blackwater IDs on Al Jazeera and said, we got great training, now we're joining the Taliban. Blackwater was the premier trainer of the Afghan counter-narcotics force and potentially could be operating in this hemisphere in what is going to be an incredibly lucrative market. But the other project that I think is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what's happening right now is that Blackwater recently started a private intelligence company, their own private CIA, called Total Intelligence Solutions. And it's being headed up by a man named J. Cofer Black, who was one of the central people in shaping the Bush administration's post-9/11 quote-unquote terror policy. Cofer Black was the head of the CIA's counterterrorism center, the man tasked with the hunt for Osama bin Laden. He did a great job at that. And he is the guy who stood before the United States Congress and said there was a before 9/11 and an after 9/11, and after 9/11 the gloves come off. He ran the CIA's extraordinary rendition program, the government-sanctioned kidnap and torture program that has been operating since the second term of the Clinton administration, and really was one of the key people in accelerating the use of torture and secret abductions around the world. He now is working for Blackwater as the company's vice chair, and his main job is heading up their private intelligence company. Unlike many of these companies' history, their primary client now is not going to be the U.S. government, although they're going to continue to work for the U.S. government. They are aggressively marketing what they call CIA-type services to Fortune 500 corporations. And what they're saying is we can bring CIA-type services to the corporate boardroom. What this means is that you have very senior U.S. intelligence officials who've worked for 30 years in the CIA. I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, liberal, or conservative. This should really piss you off. These guys, for 30 years, have been working in the CIA with access to the most sensitive intelligence that the United States government has in its possession. Their careers, their knowledge, their networks of contacts, their prestige are all on the open market for bidding or for hire. Blackwater has been hired by the Jordanian government. They're working for other corporations. We've seen the intelligence failures and scandals in this country. Why does no one talk about the fact that 70% of the combined intelligence budget of the 18 intelligence agencies in this country, 70% of that budget is outsourced to for-profit corporations with clients around the world? What is to stop them from injecting just a little bit of tainted intelligence to benefit one of their other clients or to harm one of their competitors? This is going to be one of the premier scandals of U.S. foreign policy going forward. If you talk to former CIA analysts, as I have, they'll tell you that the CIA, NSA, DIA, all of these agencies are facing a draining of their best personnel, jumping over to the private sector and bringing with them all of their knowledge, all their experience, everything they know about U.S. foreign policy and sensitive work of the U.S. government. It's now on the open market for bidding. And so what we've seen with these companies is that they have won Iraq. They got what they needed. In the case of Blackwater, they also have this badass reputation. If we can keep Paul Bremer and John Negroponte and Ryan Crocker and Condoleezza Rice in the most dangerous place on earth, imagine what we can do for your corporation or your government. Now, no one wants to talk about in that pitch the fact that they've killed countless Iraqis, inflamed tensions, been responsible for escalation of violence against U.S. soldiers in Iraq, and they're not popular with the U.S. military at all. But they don't care about that. They're on to bigger and better things. And so the thing I want to leave you with here, and then open up for discussion, is that we talk a lot in this country, in various political circles, about the influence of corporations over government. We see in the economic crisis what tremendous power in the hands of corporations, a total lack of oversight or any regulation can do to the U.S. economy. It's that times 100 in the case of the U.S. war machine, and it's deeply connected to the economy as well. But we're living in a nation where we are now in the midst of the most radical privatization agenda in our history. We see it in every aspect of our life, from healthcare and schools to prisons and law enforcement and the Frankenstein U.S. war machine now. And until we understand that it is these corporations that are essentially running the show and develop ways to challenge this corporate domination of our society, this is going to go on unabated to the point where public institutions are completely stripped down of any kind of financing, and that only those that are the most well-off in the society are going to have access to basic goods and services in this country. You know, if we think it can't happen here, we should look at the incredible looting that these companies have engaged in with the U.S. Treasury. It is very real, and many Americans are feeling the impact of it in their daily lives. It's just that the political leaders, Democrat and Republican, don't cast it in that light, and they should, because the looting of the Treasury through the war machine has everything to do and has had a tremendous impact with the state of affairs right now in this country that are being felt by working people, poor people across the board. Thank you.
If you would stand up and ask your questions, please, and keep them, I suppose, brief without long preambles, that would be great. Yes.
I want to know more about the relationship between the U.S. military and Blackwater.
Sure.
You said that it wasn't cozy, but I'm sure a lot of military end up in Blackwater.
That's a great question. Did people hear that? She was asking about the relationship.
Questions, please. Sure. What's the relationship?
Well, I think she meant me on mic so that she could hear it. She was asking what the relationship, for the third time now, what the relationship is between the U.S. military and Blackwater, and was also commenting that many people in the military end up working for these companies, she presumes. I mean, you're absolutely right. In fact, the Defense Secretary Gates has recently started talking about implementing a non-compete clause to try to stop the siphoning off of military personnel to the private sector. I mean, there's slang now in Iraq, if you talk to soldiers who come back, where if you jump from the military over to the private sector, depending on, it doesn't matter what company you go to, they call it going Blackwater. Because these soldiers are making, as I said, in the case of a special forces guy, you can get up to $70,000 or beyond. But in the case of a regular rank and file soldier, you're making $30,000, $40,000 with some bonuses and benefits for being in a war zone. But it's very enticing. You say, well, these guys aren't held to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They don't get prosecuted when things go wrong. They get much better pay. And, hey, I can leave if I want to get out of here after 2 months and go home and take the money I've made and carry on with my life. So on the one hand, you have these companies that are doing very aggressive recruiting of some of the best soldiers in the United States. The Special Operations Command has now been forced to try to compete with these companies to raise pay of special forces soldiers because so many of them are leaving the public sector and going over to the private sector. But there's another side of this. I mean, that's become a problem for the military. The flip side of it, though, is that many Iraqis, and we'll just talk about this as an example, don't see the difference between Blackwater and the 82nd Airborne Division. or Blackwater and the U.S. Marines. It's all the occupation. So when Blackwater shoots up a bunch of civilians, as they did last September in Baghdad's Nicer Square, and kill 17 Iraqi civilians and wound 24 others, when the military goes and investigates, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Tarsa says this was a criminal event. And if U.S. soldiers had carried out, they would have been subjected to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The men who did the shooting for Blackwater, we know who they are. They're walking around as free individuals right now. So the U.S. military is in a position then where, and we can debate this, they're engaged in what they feel is a hearts and minds campaign. They don't want to be running around just spraying bullets at Iraqis. So they've worked to try to build up some kind of a relationship in a community with the Iraqis, and they've gotten it to a situation where things are relatively calm. And then the mercenaries come through guarding their VIP, and they spray a bunch of people or run cars off the road. The military deals with the aftermath of it. The military deals with the blowback impact of it. And we've had military officials going all the way up to the Defense Secretary Gates, who says that these forces, when they enter the combat zone, meaning private forces, often are putting U.S. soldiers at risk because of their misconduct or their failure to coordinate with United States military commanders. In fact, I have much more faith in the ability of the U.S. military at this point to crack down on the criminal activity and misconduct of these contractors than I do on the Congress. Because with the exception of a handful of Congress members, and I can name them all, this has been a non-issue for the Congress. It should have been one of the premier issues. Regardless of how you look at it, it's dangerous for U.S. troops. The disparity in pay, the crimes that go unpunished, the money that's being spent, the incredible profits that have been taken by these companies and used to build up their own infrastructure with our taxpayer dollars, and yet there have been a handful of hearings about it. The military, though, lives with it every single day in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they have become the most prominent critics of these companies. And I find that very interesting because they're paying, with the exception of Iraqi civilians and Afghan civilians, military folks are paying the highest price for the misconduct of these companies.
Yes.
It seems to me that the genie's out of the bag. And now that it is, how would we try to get it back in, number one? Number two, what would prevent Blackwater from using, or a president who has, where there's no military oversight, what would prevent them from abusing this on our own citizens as opposed to other countries around the world?
Yeah, I mean, both of those are very important questions. I think, first of all, one story that I didn't tell, or one part of a story that I didn't tell, which is directly related to the question you have about the potential for these forces to be used inside of the United States against U.S. citizens, is that while Blackwater was hired by the Department of Homeland Security for its Hurricane Katrina operations, originally, and I had this confirmed by a senior executive from Blackwater, originally Eric Prince, the owner of the company, decided one day, I'm going to send 184 armed individuals onto the streets of a U.S. city with a Puma helicopter, and they're going to just fan out into the night. Blackwater operated for a week without any contract from any government authority. They just decided one day they were going to send their forces there. And you know, to me, we crossed the line when that happened in this country, to where someone can say, well, we're going to go and help. What's their definition of help, though? You know, are they going to shoot a woman who is taking diapers out of a Circle K because she's been systematically abandoned by the system, that there's no serious relief operation? You know, their definition of a looter, would it necessarily fit the definition that all Americans would embrace for a looter? And that is, I think, a direct violation in spirit of the Posse Comitatus Act, which would prohibit the U.S. military from engaging in domestic law enforcement activities. What's the difference between the U.S. military doing it and former U.S. military working in a for-profit operation? Well, the difference is that with the military, you'd have some semblance of an ability to have oversight or accountability. With a private company, you don't. I'm very concerned that what you're raising, I think if we fast forward 10 years into the future, it's not necessarily going to be that the government is using these forces. I think we're going to see an increase in wealthy communities, gated communities, using these kinds of security forces. They're going to be used increasingly in disaster response or national emergency situations. I think the gateway for it is that companies are going to hire other companies to do this. The government, I think it will come more in the form of the Department of Homeland Security. The first area to be privatized, I believe, is going to be the Department of Homeland Security's Border Patrol. I think the U.S. Border Patrol is going to start embracing the use of privatized soldiers. In fact, one of Blackwater's competitors, DynCorp, which is a Texas-based company, has already offered to put forward private guards to monitor the U.S.-Mexico border. I think the gateway, though, and the way we'll feel it more, is that we're going to see them increasingly on the streets working for other corporations. There's a long history in this country of private companies being used to suppress dissent, going well back to the Pinkertons, the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Blackwater's Vice President, Martin Strong, said in a recent radio interview where he was attacking me and saying I know nothing about Blackwater, that he sees Blackwater as modern-day Pinkertons. I was stunned because there's legislation that passed and is law in the U.S. called the Anti-Pinkerton Act, which prohibits the United States from doing business with a paramilitary or quasi-paramilitary organization. I think Blackwater's contracts violate the Anti-Pinkerton Act. But I share your concern, and I think that in a radically privatized society, which we're heading toward, the oversight is going to be completely absent, the regulation is going to be non-existent, and the potential for serious abuses of our human, civil, and constitutional rights are going to be in great jeopardy from these private forces.
So have they been involved in the election this time or in the banking problems that we've had recently?
Yeah, I don't think that Blackwater has been involved with the banking problems. I mean, obviously, private corporations, we're having fewer and fewer corporations that have greater and greater control over every aspect. There's a huge scandal, as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, of private corporations and the voting machines. And there was a private military company, an armed private military company in Oregon that recently offered to provide security for ballot drops when they're delivering the actual paper ballots by airfield, that they were going to guard it from any civilian unrest if the election becomes controversial.
Let's go to the men in the back, and then we'll come over here.
What do you think would shame Congress to actually enforcing things like the Anti-Pinkerton Act?
Right. What could be done to shame Congress into enforcing things like the Anti-Pinkerton Act? I think it would require at least 400 different legislators serving in Washington to actually change this problem, because it goes back, and maybe this is a sort of different answer to the one you thought I might give, but I think it has everything to do with the campaign finance system in this country. Democrats right now are getting more money than Republicans from the war industry, from the defense industry. It's not necessarily that the war industry thinks that Democrats would be better for them, although they do quite well under Democratic administrations. It's that they see which way the wind is blowing. If a congressperson was really going to go up against this system, they would be removing themselves from one of the most lucrative campaign financing pots in the U.S. political system. And I think that is part of the reason why we don't see a more aggressive approach to these companies. I also think that it has to do with utter political laziness on the part of particularly the Democrats in the Congress. To me, this would have been a no-brainer issue. I think they would have had a lot of Americans on their side if they took this on, because it cuts across political lines and party lines. In terms of pressure, Barack Obama, who actually is quite knowledgeable on this issue, has said that he is not going to move to ban Blackwater and that he cannot rule out using them in Iraq. And that's because he has an Iraq plan that is going to necessitate the use of these private forces. I'm afraid that the spread of these companies and their embedding within the U.S. national security apparatus has metastasized so quickly that at this point it would be almost impossible to legislate away from. Unfortunately, the greatest remedy, or perhaps the only remedy that many victims of these companies have, is the U.S. court system through civil litigation, where you have the families of the Blackwater men killed at Fallujah have sued the company for wrongful death. A judge recently threw that into private arbitration, and that was upheld by a appellate court, which was a great defeat for the families of those four guys. Iraqis are suing Blackwater in civilian courts in the U.S. Courageously, Henry Waxman recently called on Barack Obama to ban the use of mercenary forces if he's elected president, if Obama's elected president. And his call was joined by several other Democrats. I think in terms of one really critical action that people can take if Barack Obama becomes president is to really put pressure on your representatives, be they Republican or Democrat, to try to demand an end to the outsourcing of combat within U.S. military operations.
You don't have them use Blackwater for their own.
Well, Blackwater specifically has, I think, should be banned from any more government contracting until all of the investigations of the company are completed and we understand all of the facts. I think that this company has shown itself to be reckless, above the law, and a danger to civilians and troops, and I think it's time that Blackwater's contracting with the U.S. government be frozen. I think it should be abolished. I don't think these companies should be allowed to operate in the name of the United States of America abroad. But I think at a minimum it needs to be frozen until a full and complete review can be done of all the scandals involving this company.
Can we try this man over here who's been waiting for a while, and we'll try to get a couple more in.
Thanks so much for your comments. I'm a 30-year veteran, active duty Army. my impression is, from reading of history and in my most recent years in Europe, and seeing the drawdown take place, that it seems that we, as a country, never learned the lesson of drawing down so severely that we set ourselves up for the very thing that you described. I have to admit that I have some concern when we extricate ourselves from our current involvement, what will happen, especially in the face of what you described on what I would call the other side. They are not our friends. I just have great concern. I guess what I'm confessing as a citizen as well as a soldier is we're all involved in this. We're looking for those peace dividends, so-called. We're seeing part of the result of it right now.
Well, these are very. Thank you very much for that, and I think you've raised a number of extremely important issues. Just to put it in a sort of analogous situation. With public education in this country, they defund schools, and then they say, well, schools are failing, so we have to privatize schools. In a way, that's also what happened with the military. People often blame Bill Clinton for it, and certainly Bill Clinton played a role in this. But this really began in earnest when Dick Cheney was the defense secretary under George H.W. Bush. One of the things that he did, one of the last things he did as defense secretary in the early 1990s before Clinton became president, was to hire Halliburton to perform a study on how to privatize as much of the U.S. military bureaucracy as possible. And the idea was to outsource as much of the military operation as you could without actually crossing the line into outsourcing the combat. And that if you have private companies that are driving the trucks and doing the laundry and cooking the food and serving the food to the troops, then that means that all of your soldiers can engage in combat. And Bill Clinton was a major supporter of this. We talk about Dick Cheney getting all these no-bid contracts at Halliburton. Well, who do you think gave him the no-bid contracts? It was Clinton in the 90s. And so while the dominant narrative is that Clinton cut military spending and Clinton was anti-military and Clinton was shutting down military bases, there was something much more insidious that was taking place. And that was that they were cutting funding on paper to the military, but then radically increasing funding to the private sector participation in the U.S. war machine, to the point where now, and I think this is the point you're getting at, the U.S. military is in a situation where these companies are like the American Express card of U.S. foreign policy. They can't leave home without them. And they're so deeply embedded in it, and it's not cost efficient, and they're not more effective, and they're not a better fighting force, but they have become a necessary part of going abroad and of U.S. foreign policy. And they're also a part of it that does devastating damage to the United States' reputation around the world. And so, when you talk about the drawing down, one of Blackwater's executives said recently that he could see a scenario where the U.S. military could give the impression of a withdrawal from Iraq, but that they could just increase the use of private sector forces so it wouldn't really officially be the United States military that was occupying Iraq, and said this could be very good for our business. And I think that's the kind of cynicism that permeates this industry. There's no sense of, they use patriotic rhetoric. They say, well, we have our employees take an oath to the Constitution. There's nothing really effective to prevent them from taking actions that are contrary to the national security of the United States or to the will of the people through the democratically elected officials that serve or lead this country. I think this is one of the premier scandals of our time, and it requires veterans, I think, are an incredible part of the discourse in this society, and I'm so moved and motivated by the fact that young men and women have come back from Iraq and organized Iraq Veterans Against the War and are doing what they can to try to raise awareness. They've been there in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan and have become some of the most important people in educating the broader U.S. public about what actually has taken place over these 5 years of occupation in Iraq. I thank you for what you've done.
Yes, sir.
My question is about the Blackwater Intelligence Agency of the future, private CIA. I don't understand what on earth a corporation would hire Blackwater for in those circumstances, and what's wrong with the corporations, because the CIA's got a long track record of failure in their intelligence side, and even a worse track record of failure in their operations side.
Right. Yeah. On the issue of the future of privatized intelligence or the future of Blackwater, what they're doing is creating a new potential model where a company can go into an oil-rich nation like Nigeria and no longer have to work with the Nigerian military junta to defend its operations. You can bring in your own paramilitary force, and you send in your own private reconnaissance team to do an intelligence assessment, to monitor the roads that you would use to get from point A to point B, or the airfield that you would use, or to liaise with government officials to make sure that you have all of your clearances. I share your comments about the CIA. I think we've had categorical disasters. We've also had incredible crimes that have been committed in the names of the people of this country by U.S. covert operators. What the real danger is, though, is that you have people who have been trained and have access to very sensitive information and contacts around the world that they're now going to be able to use all of that in the private sector for corporations. What it means is that there are more institutions in society that are going to be able to hire those kinds of teams of people, or those kinds of companies or entities to do their bidding. And so you're essentially taking the U.S. intelligence operation and putting it on the open market for for-profit corporations to rent out. That to me is a great risk involved here.
I'm afraid we're out of time.
Oh.
We have, thank you for your
Thank you, everyone.
questions. Thank you, Jeremy.
I'm speaking tonight at 7 at the University of Texas.
Let's get this announcement in before you leave.
At the University of Texas tonight, I'm speaking at 7 o'clock. I'm not sure where it is, but if you check online, you can find it. If you just Google it, I'm sure you can find it.
And we'll move to the book tent to sign and sell books. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
We just heard from Jeremy Scahill. He gave a very, very insightful speech.